And this from Ash Sarkar, absolutely lighting up Emily Thornbury.
I'm sat across from two very, very intelligent people.
Doubt. They're not very bright.
And unfortunately, the way you're talking is treating people like mugs. You can talk about condemnation all you want. You can talk about reminding Israel of their international obligations all you want. But until you're talking about suspending arms sales to Israel, until the Americans are talking about suspending military aid to Israel, all of that finger wagging in the world will not stop Netanyahu from doing what he wants to do, which is launching an absolutely terrible, abhorrent ground assault on Rafah. The images which are coming out on social media at the moment have been for months from Rafah of children buried under the rubble, body parts blown to smithereens. This is the result of Israel being emboldened and effectively being given a carte blanche to interpret its, in Emily's words from October 2023, its absolute right to self-defense to mean collectively punishing the Gazan people.
Well, Emily?
And the stuff we're hearing about the Shifa Hospital and other ones as well, executions, these are absolutely abhorrent actions here, and they should have been, the international community should have sanctioned Israel over this. Let's be honest now, should have absolutely sanctioned Israel over this. The Americans said that going into Rafah is a red line. Well, clearly red lines don't mean much to the Americans. And so, there was a story out, I'm going to cover it in this video, that Americans are concerned that Israel is committing war crimes in Rafah, which goes to show you that, people are discussing it more openly. Politicians are discussing it a little bit more openly. There's potential war crimes happening, but, politicians, until they suspend things like arms sales, it won't change much.
Well, I think that 2 days, 3 days after the first incursions into Israel, when so many people had been killed and there were so many hostages that had been taken, and we were in a live situation.
Well, and there are still hostages.
And we believed, but they were, but it was still, there was still fighting going on the ground in Israel, and there were, as far as I understood, there was going to be an attempt to get the hostages back. At that.
And at that point, Israel were talking about essentially mass devastation of Gaza, and what we found out subsequently is there's been no attempt to get the hostages out. There was no way of Israel really going in there to go into those tunnels to get the hostages out. There would be no real way of them being able to do that. The only way would have been through negotiations, and in the end they did manage to negotiate, I think, to get some of the hostages out later on. And so this shows you that Labour's initial, kind of some of these frontbenchers, their initial response is very poor when they said Israel has a right to defend itself, given in the context of cutting off food, water and energy. That's what they were asked about, and that's something we'll discuss in a minute.
At that stage, just cut the lights off and so on was the right thing to do. But as I said at the time, and
so she doesn't address the other stuff. She talked about the lights. It wasn't about the lights. It was cutting off energy. That's things people use to heat their homes. Hospitals use that to fuel their machines. She wasn't talking initially in the first clip in last year. She wasn't talking about the lights. What she's saying is very disingenuous.
There has been some selective reporting. It absolutely is not within international law to cut off supplies to a nation. So
you were asked specifically about food and water,
yes,
not just the lights.
Yes,
and you said Israel has an absolute right to defend itself.
And as I also said, as the guy from the UN had said before, I'm sorry for people who hadn't seen the programme, but for the person who was from the UN who was on Newsnight before me had said, within a short period in a war, you can cut off in order to... So essentially, if they were going to go into Gaza to try and get the hostages back, then in that very short period, then it would be right to kind of... and we know that's what Israel has been doing on and off in Gaza anyway. But in this period, that was the thing to do. Not to do it so that you starve people, and not to do it so that you cut off their power so that they don't have water. That's, you do it in a short period when you're defending yourself, because you have an absolute right to defend yourself, and that's the right thing.
You don't, though. You don't have a right to cut off food and food and water to people, because chances are those terrorists are going to have food, especially stored away in the tunnel systems. They could have rations, things like that, long storage. The average civilian doesn't. So this point here is just so stupid.
Thing to do, but it always had to be, as we always said, within the confines of international law.
I think.
But you're the same people who said the ICJ case is pointless. You said it was a distraction. So how do we follow international law if it has to go to the courts? And court cases, take years. Especially when this is the same Labour Party that criticised Putin, saying he had broken international law. It doesn't make sense, does it? How can it be the case that Israel hasn't broken international law despite their invasion of Palestine, in attacking hospitals, civilians indiscriminately, but Russia has broken international law by attacking Ukraine and attacking civilians indiscriminately? Make it make sense, people.
I think that's a bit like saying, I want to burgle this house, but in a lawful way. I think these two things are completely contradictory.
It's you've got my stuff in your house, and I'm going in to get it.
But you can't do that, though. Legally, you can't do it. You have to go to the police. This is a really poor defence from Emily Thornbury. You can't, if someone has stolen your things, I don't think you have a right to go in there and physically take your item back. I think you'd be classed as trespassing at that point. And also further to this, it's not just they've gone in there taking their stuff back. They've gone in there and murdered the family that reside in that house, and then are probably going to take that house. Let's be honest now.
And the last thing that I would say is, I think it is for the birds, the idea that you could not see what would be happening now. What was coming out from Israel in terms of politicians' mouths, the references to Amalek.
Also, we've seen their actions in the West Bank. We've seen what they've done in the West Bank, tearing down people's houses, detaining them without cause, attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Like, the idea that Israel would go in there and it'd be according to international law is kind of crazy to me, just thinking about it, because they've broken international law consistently with the settlements. They don't care. This is kind of wild. The more you think about it, the more wild you realise how bad Labour's initial statement was.
Saying that there are no uninvolved civilians, even in those very, very early days, it was clear that civilians were being considered fair targets. So then when you've got leading politicians saying that the right to self-defence includes cutting of food, includes cutting of water and power, that either means that you were unable to see what millions of other people could see was going to happen, which would make me question the quality of the politicians we have in this country, or there's an element of being disingenuous, where you didn't think you had the political room to say this at the start, but now you're worried about the images coming out.
Okay, so may I answer that? So I think within the short...
The aggression, the pointing there, it's really rude, that.
...period, of the first few days, when they were trying to get their hostages back...
They weren't trying to get their hostages out, though. We know that. They weren't trying to. They went in there to cause damage.
There is one thing, and as things move on...
They were literally blowing up buildings.
We have been completely clear about what it is that we expect. We expect there to be a ceasefire. It is not necessary for Israel to continue in this way. Israel had an absolute right to defend itself, but now there needs to be an immediate ceasefire, and we have made that clear.
Would you suspend arms sales?
Well, I'll answer that question.
Okay. So what I would say is this, is that when we look at some of the images, and I can't sit here in this television studio or in London and decide on a case-by-case basis on what, whether there has been a breach of international law.
We literally sanctioned Russia for less. Cut them out of the CHAP system and things like that. Literally did, locked up their money, did it for less than what we're seeing. And, we need a court ruling. We can't mandate on if Israel's broken international law when they've attacked civilians indiscriminately.
Here or there or whatever instances, but as a whole one begins to really be concerned that there may well be some breaches of international law. And if that is right, then what we need to do, and listen, I've been doing this a long time. I did this when we were arming Saudi Arabia in Yemen. And what you do is you look at what arms are being sold. Are they being used? British arms are being sold. Are they being used in the conflict?
Well, this conflict's been going on for about 6 months now, I think. So, if you can't see what's happening by now, I really question your judgment. You might be have been doing this for a long time, but clearly you've not been doing that good for a long time if you can't see it now.
And is there a breach of international law? Now, we can see what seems to be on the face of it breaches of international law. The question then is, what arms are we selling and are they being used? Well, and that's quite a difficult and a technical thing that needs to be done. And that's why we want to see that
I mean, yeah, it's kind of just hiding behind we need to see that. Like, Labour could call for it. Labour should really call for it, because you can't back a country that's doing this. You can't back a country, even if we're giving non-lethal aid, you cannot back a country that is doing what Israel has done. And, if you want to look at what she actually said...
Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
So, there's your answer right there. She was asked about it. She said, yeah, Israel does have the absolute right to defend itself in the context of cutting off food, fuel, and food, water, and energy. And it's an appropriate answer at this time. And, given that, she went out to bat for Starmer after Starmer, I think after about a week or two, clarified that Israel really shouldn't be doing this, is pretty embarrassing for her. But we'll talk about this kind of interview, why Owen Jones kind of thinks she had to do this. There's more here. At the time, Starmer will sack any Labour frontbenchers who votes for the Gaza ceasefire. So this was last year. One Labour source telling the Telegraph that support for a ceasefire is not compatible with serving on the front bench. 19 shadow ministers have called for a ceasefire thus far. So it took him a while to